Picture this. It is Tuesday night. B-52 bombers are already airborne. Their targets are locked. Iranian power plants, Iranian bridges, civilian infrastructure. The pilots have their orders, their coordinates loaded, their mission clock counting down. And then, 90 minutes before the point of no return, the phone rings. The planes bank left. They turn around. They head home. No strikes, no explosions. No civilization reduced to fire and ash. What just happened? And more importantly, what does it mean for your gas prices, your retirement account, and a world that came terrifyingly close to the edge of something it might never have walked back from? Stay with us, because what we're about to walk you through is one of the most consequential 48-hour sequences in modern geopolitical history. We're going to cover every layer: the military crisis, the economic catastrophe, the secret negotiations, the Pakistan surprise, the deal that almost wasn't, and the fragile, dangerous, utterly uncertain path forward. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the next 2 weeks could still determine whether this war explodes again, or finds a genuine off-ramp. If you're watching this for the first time, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. We cover military and geopolitical developments in real time, without the spin, without the delay. Thousands of subscribers are already getting this analysis first. Don't be the last to know. Hit that subscribe button. Let's start from the beginning, because context is everything. This war, and yes, we are going to call it a war, began on February 28, 2026. That is the date the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran under what the Pentagon designated Operation Epic Fury. The targets were not symbolic. They included military installations, nuclear-related facilities, and key Iranian leadership structures. This was not a warning shot. This was not a pinprick strike. This was the opening of a war. Iran's response came fast, and it was devastating. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if you've heard that phrase before and it didn't fully land, let us put the numbers in front of you right now, because the scale of what that means is genuinely staggering. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 miles. That is the width of the English Channel at its thinnest crossing, the gap between England and France. And through that 21-mile bottleneck flows roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil per day. That is approximately 20% of all global seaborne oil trade. Every tanker carrying Saudi oil, every vessel loaded in Kuwait, every ship departing Qatar with liquefied natural gas, all of it must pass through that narrow corridor. When Iran closed it, they didn't just cut off oil. They triggered what the International Energy Agency officially described as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. That is not this channel editorializing. That is the IEA, the institution whose sole function is to monitor global energy systems, using the word unprecedented. Bigger than the 1973 Arab oil embargo. Bigger than the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Bigger than anything in the recorded history of modern energy markets. Brent crude surged past $100 a barrel for the first time in 4 years. It peaked at $126 per barrel. Analysts at Bloomberg were running models showing prices could reach $200 a barrel if the closure extended through Q2 2026. The Dallas Federal Reserve published research projecting that a single quarter-long Hormuz closure would lower global real GDP growth by nearly 3 percentage points on an annualized basis. That is not a rounding error. That is a recession trigger. And here is where it gets interesting, because this was never just about oil. The United Nations Trade and Development Agency warned of cascading damage to food prices, fertilizer supply chains, and aviation. Gulf states like Kuwait and Qatar began facing what economists were quietly calling a grocery supply emergency, with 70% of their food imports disrupted by mid-March. According to the World Economic Forum, The strait carries roughly a third of global seaborne methanol trade, nearly half of all global sulfur exports, significant volumes of aluminum, helium, fertilizers, and the petroleum coke that feeds electric vehicle battery manufacturing. The Philippines implemented a temporary 4-day working week to manage fuel costs. Airlines were rerouting flights around the Middle East, adding hours to journeys and burning more fuel in the process. Major shipping companies, including Maersk, had suspended Middle East routes entirely. The Stimson Center described the Strait of Hormuz not as a tactical lever, but as, in their own phrasing, a transmission belt between regional war and the global economy. That is the lens through which you need to understand everything that happened Tuesday night. Now, before we get into the mechanics of this deal, let's talk about the 48 hours that led to it. Because this ceasefire was not a clean diplomatic process. It was chaotic, last minute, and full of contradictions that are still playing out right now. We'll come back to those contradictions in a moment, but first, the pressure. In the days leading up to the Tuesday deadline, President Trump had been escalating his public messaging to an extraordinary degree. On Easter Sunday, April 5th, he posted on Truth Social, and the exact wording matters here. He wrote that Tuesday would be, in his words, Power Plant Day and Bridge Day all wrapped up in one in Iran, and called on Iran to open the strait or be living in hell. That is a sitting president of the United States threatening to destroy civilian infrastructure via social media. The escalation was real. The deadline was real. And inside the White House, there was a war of its own. On one side, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Senator Lindsey Graham, all pushing Trump to reject any deal unless Iran made major upfront concessions. Their argument was strategic. Accept a weak deal now, and you signal to Iran that threatening the strait is a winning move every time. On the other side, Vice President J.D. Vance, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner, all advising Trump to take a deal if one could be reached. Their argument was practical. The global economy was hemorrhaging. Every day the strait stayed closed was a day the damage compounded. And then Pakistan stepped in. This is the detail that gets glossed over in most coverage, and it absolutely should not be. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir personally reached out to President Trump. They proposed a framework, a 2-week ceasefire during which Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz and both sides would enter formal negotiations. Trump confirmed in his announcement that he agreed to suspend strikes on Iran based on direct conversations with Prime Minister Sharif and Field Marshal Munir, who requested he hold off on the destructive force being sent that night. Pakistan is not an obvious mediator in a U.S.-Iran conflict. So why did it work? Because Pakistan had both the motivation and the credibility. Pakistan relies heavily on Gulf oil imports. Their economy had been hammered by the Hormuz closure. And critically, they had maintained functional relationships with both Tehran and Washington. This was geopolitical improvisation at its most human. Messy, unpredicted, real. And it worked. Now let's get into the precise mechanics of what was actually agreed. Because this is where it gets genuinely fascinating and genuinely complicated. On the U.S. side, Trump announced a 2-week suspension of strikes on Iran. He described it on Truth Social as a double-sided ceasefire. He stated the United States had met and exceeded all military objectives. He acknowledged receiving a 10-point proposal from Iran and called it a workable basis on which to negotiate. He was careful, and this distinction matters, not to say he was accepting Iran's 10-point plan, only that it provided a foundation for talks. On the Iranian side, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi confirmed the deal in a formal statement issued on behalf of Iran's Supreme National Security Council. He confirmed that if U.S. attacks on Iran were halted, Iranian armed forces would cease their defensive operations. He confirmed that safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz would be possible during the 2-week window, but with one critical caveat. He specified, via coordination with Iranian armed forces and with due consideration of technical limitations. What are those technical limitations? Sea mines. During the conflict, Iranian forces laid mines across sections of the strait. They cannot all be located and removed quickly. This is not a minor logistical footnote. This is a fundamental physical constraint on the speed of reopening. Iran is essentially saying ships can pass, but only through corridors we designate and coordinate. Given that over 100 ships transited the strait daily before the war, and the total for the entire previous month of conflict was barely 100 ships combined, you can already visualize the bottleneck that is forming. And then, almost immediately, the ceasefire showed its first fractures. Within minutes of the announcement, missiles were launched from Iran toward Israel. One was intercepted on the outskirts of Tel Aviv. Iranian naval forces also reportedly halted oil tanker traffic through the strait again, hours after the first tankers had been allowed through, citing Israel's continued strikes in Lebanon. Persian Gulf states, Bahrain, the UAE, and Kuwait reported new Iranian attacks on oil infrastructure. Iran's parliament speaker accused the United States of violating 3 points of the agreement: no ceasefire in Lebanon, a drone entering Iranian airspace, and denial of Iran's right to nuclear enrichment. If you're now subscribed and watching this unfold, good, because this is exactly the analysis that mainstream coverage isn't giving you. Like this video, share it, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss a single update on this. Here is where it gets interesting. And this is the part that requires careful thinking about how ceasefires actually work. The disconnect between what Iran's leadership agreed to and what Iran's military forces were actually doing in those first hours is not necessarily bad faith at the top level. It reflects something structurally significant. The wave of assassinations throughout this conflict, targeting Iranian commanders, IRGC leadership, and naval officers, has severely degraded Iran's chain of command. The Iranian military is operating in some meaningful sense as compartmentalized cells that are not always receiving or processing orders from Tehran with speed or clarity. We saw this dynamic during what analysts have called the 12-day war. Ceasefires get announced. Lower-level units with access to launch systems keep firing anyway. It does not mean the deal is dead. It means the implementation will be messy, contested, and dangerous. Exactly as Vice President Vance acknowledged when he characterized the situation as a fragile truce. He told reporters the ceasefire won't hold if the strait remains closed, while simultaneously acknowledging he was already seeing early signs of increased traffic. His exact message? If we don't see the strait reopening, the president is not going to abide by our terms. That is a very specific ultimatum tied to a very specific deliverable. Now let's get to the Lebanon problem, because this is the most politically explosive piece of the entire puzzle. Israel and Iran have been fighting a separate but deeply connected war. Israel has invaded southern Lebanon and conducted sustained airstrikes targeting Hezbollah, Iran's most significant and battle-hardened proxy force. Pakistan's Prime Minister Sharif publicly stated the ceasefire covered Lebanon. Iranian negotiators appear to have understood Lebanon to be included, but the White House stated clearly, Lebanon is not part of this agreement. Netanyahu confirmed his government would comply with the ceasefire on Iran and continue striking Lebanon. So you have a situation where the mediator says one thing, one party believes one thing, and the other party's position is something else entirely. European leaders, Germany, France, Italy, the United Kingdom, Denmark, Spain, the Netherlands, and Canada, issued a joint statement calling on all sides to implement the ceasefire, including in Lebanon. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called it a potential solution to what she warned could become a severe global energy crisis. That joint statement carries significant diplomatic weight. It carries zero enforcement mechanism. And we need to talk about Iran's 10-point proposal, because this document is the key to understanding where the next 2 weeks actually go. Iran's 10 points, as laid out through Iranian state media, are extraordinarily ambitious. Point 1. Iran wants guarantees it will not be attacked again. Point 2. A permanent end to the war, not a ceasefire, a permanent end. Point 3. An end to Israeli strikes on Lebanon. Point 4. The lifting of all U.S. sanctions on Iran. Point 5. An end to all regional fighting against Iranian allies. Point 6. In return, Iran would open the Strait of Hormuz. Point 7. And this is the one that will generate the most friction. Iran wants to impose a transit fee of $2 million per ship. Point 8. Oman would share in those fees. Point 9. Iran would provide rules of safe passage through Hormuz. Point 10. Hormuz fees would be used for reconstruction, not reparations. Let's linger on point 7. $2 million per ship sounds almost modest when you're talking about very large crude carriers. But the precedent it attempts to set is extraordinary. If Iran can charge a fee to traverse an international strait, what stops Denmark from charging vessels through the Danish straits? What stops Spain from levying fees through the Strait of Gibraltar? This would be reversing nearly 2 centuries of freedom of navigation norms that underpin the entire global trading system. The world moved away from this model deliberately, and for good reason. Iran knows they are unlikely to get it. The strategic value of Point 7 is as a bargaining chip, something they are willing to sacrifice in exchange for concessions they want more: sanctions relief, nuclear enrichment rights, and security guarantees. The White House's official position? Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt stated that the original 10-point plan was, quoting directly here, literally thrown in the garbage by President Trump and his negotiating team. So there is already a fundamental dispute between what Iran says was agreed upon and what Washington acknowledges agreeing to. This mirrors every major ceasefire in history. Both sides frame the moment as their victory. Iran state media is broadcasting internally that U.S. bombers turned around because Iran held firm. American media is reporting that the military campaign created the leverage for diplomatic success. Both narratives are politically necessary. Neither is fully accurate. This brings us to the journalist release, because it is a piece of the story that deserves more attention than it is getting. American journalist Shelley Kidson had been kidnapped 1 week prior in Baghdad by an Iran-backed Iraqi Shia militia, reportedly Kataib Hezbollah, not to be confused with Lebanese Hezbollah. She was abducted by a group operating inside Iraq with Iranian backing. Critically, she was released before the ceasefire announcement. According to Fox News, confirmed by the State Department, her release was the result of intensive behind-the-scenes work by the Iraqi government, operating separately from the main Iran-U.S. negotiations. This matters because it tells us something important about Iraq's capacity and motivation as an independent diplomatic player, not just a proxy battlefield for Iranian influence. Iraq does not want this war. They are absorbing collateral damage daily, and when they had the ability to quietly resolve one piece of this crisis, they did it. That is a signal worth tracking. Now let's zoom out, because to understand why Iran is negotiating the way it is negotiating, you have to understand a history that goes much further back than February 28, 2026. The Strait of Hormuz has been at the center of Iranian strategic thinking for decades. Iran's ability to threaten the strait has historically been both its greatest leverage point and its greatest vulnerability, simultaneously. Its leverage, because it can cause enormous global pain almost immediately. Its vulnerability, because actually closing the strait also devastates Iran's own oil revenues. Iran needs to export oil. Every day the strait is closed is another day Iran itself is hemorrhaging income. The pattern of escalation and de-escalation in the strait goes back to the tanker war of the 1980s, when the U.S. military had to escort oil tankers through Gulf waters under Operation Earnest Will. The current situation has echoes of that period, but the scale is different. The global economic interdependence is categorically different, and the military capabilities on all sides, drone warfare, precision strikes, the ability to mine and demine waterways at speed, are in a different universe from anything seen in that era. What makes this ceasefire structurally fragile is precisely what makes it historically significant. For the first time, Iran's Supreme National Security Council has formally acknowledged a ceasefire and confirmed willingness to negotiate based on a U.S.-originated proposal framework. Iran's supreme leader personally approved the deal. In the internal politics of the Iranian regime, that level of explicit top-level endorsement matters, even if the military chain of command remains fractured, even if lower-level units keep firing. Now let's talk economics, because the markets told us something Tuesday night, and what they said is important. The Dallas Federal Reserve's modeling is stark. A single quarter of Hormuz closure would lower global real GDP growth by nearly 3 percentage points on an annualized basis. Oil had already surged to $126 a barrel at its peak. The ceasefire announcement sent crude prices plunging below $100 a barrel almost immediately. Global stock markets surged. S&P 500 futures indicated a jump of more than 2% at open. The market was pricing in relief. But that relief is premised on a ceasefire that is already showing cracks. And here is the bigger picture reality that every government watching this needs to sit with. This is not a peace deal. This is not even close to a peace deal. As analyst Rob Pinfold told Al Jazeera, all sides have basically agreed to disagree and kicked their core disagreements into the long grass. The enrichment question, the sanctions question, the regional proxy forces question, the normalization of Iranian sovereignty over maritime traffic, which is what their 10-point plan is effectively demanding. None of these issues have been resolved. None will be resolved in 2 weeks. They may not be resolvable in 2 years. What this ceasefire is a pause. A critically important pause. A pause that prevents what could have been an irreversible military escalation. A pause that gives the global economy a window to breathe. A pause that gives diplomats a table to sit at. The G7 nations, plus EU leadership, calling it a potential solution to a severe global energy crisis, are correct. But only if the pause becomes something more durable, and that is not guaranteed. So what do we watch for in the days ahead? Watch the strait. Not just whether ships are moving. Watch what kinds of ships, under what conditions, and under whose coordination. If Iran is demanding Iranian armed forces coordination for every vessel, that is not freedom of navigation. That is Iranian sovereignty over international waters. The White House has already stated that Iran charging tolls would be considered a violation of the deal's terms. These two positions are not yet reconciled. Watch Lebanon. Israel has been explicit. The ceasefire does not cover Lebanon. Iran and Pakistan believe it does. If Israeli strikes in Lebanon continue at their current intensity, Iran's military factions will use that as justification to resume attacks, possibly regardless of what their political leadership in Tehran has formally agreed to. The Lebanon variable could unravel this deal faster than any other single factor. Watch Islamabad. The talks beginning Friday, April 10th, will be the first real test of whether there is a genuine negotiating path. Vice President Vance leading the U.S. delegation is significant. It signals this is a priority at the highest level of the executive branch. But Iran's delegation's instructions, the gap between the 10-point and 15-point proposals, and the nuclear enrichment red line are all enormous obstacles that have not moved. And watch the markets. Oil below $100 is the market's verdict on cautious optimism. If Hormuz traffic resumes meaningfully, prices fall further. If it stalls, if a new attack occurs, if Lebanon triggers a collapse of the ceasefire framework, prices spike back toward that $126 peak very fast. The world economy cannot absorb a full Q2 closure of the Hormuz Strait without entering what analysts are already calling a potential stagflationary shock. Here is the bottom line. Tuesday night's ceasefire is real. The bombers turned around. The bombs did not fall. The strait is, for now, nominally open to coordinated passage. An American journalist is free, and two of the most consequential adversaries in the global energy system are sitting down at a table in Islamabad in less than 48 hours to try to determine whether this war can permanently end. That is not nothing. That is actually remarkable, given that 72 hours ago, the President of the United States was posting about civilizations dying, and Iranian students were forming human shields around power plants. But let's be clear-eyed. This is fragile. Vice President Vance used that exact word, fragile. And fragile things break. The ceasefire has already been tested by post-announcement missile launches, renewed Hormuz closure reports, Lebanese strike continuations, and a fundamental dispute between the two parties about what they actually agreed to. The next 2 weeks will tell us whether the world's most consequential military conflict of 2026 has found a genuine off-ramp, or whether Tuesday night was simply the pause before the next escalation. We are going to keep covering this in real time. Every development, every negotiating shift, every market signal, every escalation. You'll hear about it here first. If you are not subscribed to this channel yet, now is genuinely the moment. Hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening right now. Because the next 2 weeks are going to matter, and you are going to want to be watching.